Hi, my name is Tijana Blanusa. I'm a principal horticultural scientist at the RHS. During this talk, I was hoping to give you a summary of recent RHS research on urban hedges and their ability to provide multiple ecosystem services and benefits to the urban environment. So this research comes in the context of our other work, which looks at various forms of green infrastructure, green roofs and green walls, urban gardens, street trees, and their ability to regulate air temperatures, provide building insulation, improve air quality, reduce rainfall runoff, and provide other environmental benefits. And the makeup of the team is such that we are focusing primarily on the role of plants and their function and to an extent in structure. And we are testing the hypothesis within all these forms of work that plants with different types of structure and function differ in the extent of the services that they are able to provide, and also that each of those green infrastructure interventions and each of those plants provides many simultaneous services. While we're usually studying them one at a time, what's important in the urban context is this multiplicity of those simultaneous services which plants provide. So what I wanted to show you here are pieces of information from two very recent papers, and they're both listed as references at the end of this presentation. The first one is around review of what information is available to tell us how well or less well urban hedges can perform a number of environmental functions. The reasons why we focused on hedges is because they're a compact form of green infrastructure which are widely used in British urban context and suburban context. They're cheap and linear type of vegetation, which has a potential to deliver a range of benefits, and therefore understanding which species and which characteristics of those species are important to provide a number of benefits well is what we were interested in. So what we have done is we have, myself and a team of colleagues at Universities of Reading and Sheffield and the RHS as well, have gone and searched the peer-reviewed scientific literature up to 2019 in great detail to try and understand what research has been published into this range of services that are listed in the first column, how well hedges provide biodiversity, pollination support, noise mitigation, rainfall, pollutant capture, carbon sequestration. We've tried to see which papers were specifically looking at hedges, which papers were focusing on urban context, and which ones were focusing on species particularly, because what we have found, especially for some of the services, including rainfall management, while there is some research which is in hedges, it's, for example, in agricultural context largely, and usually treating hedges as a kind of monolithic structure rather than trying to understand whether planting a species A would have a different impact from planting a species B. And we've created, just as a guide, this sort of matrix to try and understand where the gaps are, where a lot is already known from the literature, and I'll particularly then focus on this rainfall component later in my talk, because that's a piece of research which we have then gone and done ourselves. So in terms of this review, literature review, we have reviewed well over 150 papers and looked at 45 different species, trying to find what literature is saying about them. The species we have chosen were the ones that are widely inquired about in the Royal Horticultural Society's advisory support system. We've also consulted with colleagues in British nurseries. We've also looked at some nursery sort of catalogues for neighbouring countries to the UK in terms of climate and similarities in use, and we were able to then identify how much is known around all of these 45 species and then particular services. And in this very, very detailed table, which I'm not going to go through verbatim here, you can hopefully read it at your own leisure, plus the links to the summaries are provided in the right-hand corner of the slide to the full paper and RHS's summary of it. What we are listing there are the species which have been shown in the literature to provide some of these services, but also in the middle column, characteristics of canopies or plants in terms of their structure or function, which are linked with good provision of those particular services. So just as an example, we know that to capture airborne particulate pollution, the literature so far tells us that the characteristics such as large and dense canopy, small ovate leaves, hairy leaves, are usually linked with better ability of a species to capture the pollutants. In a lot of these cases, there's a lot of nuances and detail which needs to be also looked at. But this is just really a starting guide which links the species and some overall characteristics with their ability to provide certain service. In this review, we have also looked at plant sort of attributes that may be less favorable or certain disservices that plants can also cause or provide, and we've particularly looked at whether there are issues in the species that we were interested in around their allergenicity, invasiveness, and to what extent they are demanding when it comes to their management. And again, details would be in those links and in the full paper around these issues. So moving on to slightly more specific information, after we have done this literature review, or rather almost in parallel with it, what we have noticed is that in the urban context, there was some gap in understanding how a species choice for hedges influences the amount of runoff that those hedges can provide. The amount of runoff that can be reduced through the provision of those hedges. So we have started by using, in the experimental context, 7 different species, both deciduous and evergreen, and we've looked at a number of things, and I will particularly focus on rainfall capture in this presentation. We have done the experiments with them both in individual plants, glasshouse type experiments, just to get our heads around how well those plants are growing, how much water they need, what are their transpiration rates, what's the structure of their canopy, and so on. And then we took our best and worst performers into the field situation and then did some experiments to try and look at how much they can delay runoff, and in terms of volume and in terms of time. So here I'm going to show some results from the field experiments. The experiments are published in a paper, Blanusa et Hedley 2019, and again the link is at the end of this presentation. And what we have done there is we have, for want of a better word, created a mini hedge. We've planted 3 plants in a large trough in a container and pruned them to have some sort of hedge-like shape. We have compared 3 species, Cotoneaster franchetii, hawthorn, Crataegus monogyna, and Thuya plicata. We've had repeats of each of the species. We've also had bare substrate as our control. And what we have done is we have then applied artificial rainfall on them. A colleague of mine at the RHS has constructed, for want of a better word, a rainfall contraption, which allowed us to apply rainfall at fixed intensity and with droplet sizes which were commensurate with what you could expect in an intense rainfall in reality. And we have either applied the rainfall in situations where substrate was fully wet, so we were just trying to understand what the contribution of the canopy is when no water can be held in the soil, or we were then giving plants a period of a number of days of not watering, so plants were transpiring and losing water and the substrate was drying out, and then we were trying to understand what is the contribution of transpiration, which is different in the chosen species, and then how does that affect the delay of runoff. And we've measured a number of parameters which are linked to soil water content and plant function, namely leaf stomatal conductance primarily, but also we've looked at canopy density and leaf area and canopy volume. So what we have found is between the different species, we registered a significant delay of runoff in terms of time and a reduction in volume of runoff in 2 species we've tested, Cotoneaster and Crataegus, even when the soil was fully saturated. So that was just solely canopy contribution to runoff delay and runoff reduction. What we will try and relate that to a number of parameters, but what we couldn't really explain why that. I mean, we have actually been able to, or rather, we were thinking that it may be linked to the canopy density, but it wasn't. An explanatory variable. So we are also now beginning to think that we may need to look at factors such as perhaps root volume or canopy architecture, branch angle. However, what we are absolutely clear about is that there were species differences, that the greatest runoff and the smallest delay was with bare soil, followed by Thuya, but then significant delay with Cotoneaster and hawthorn. When it comes to looking at the contribution of evapotranspiration, again, there were species differences, and again, Cotoneaster and hawthorn were reducing the volume of runoff most, and also delaying the runoff, the moment at which the water begins to leak from our containers most, compared to bare soil and also compared to Thuya. The soil moisture content was significantly influencing the amount of runoff, and very likely that is because of the higher transpiration rate. So the drier the soil, which becomes dry because of the higher transpiration rate by the plant, the lesser the runoff and the longer delay of runoff there is. So what we have effectively found is that dense and large canopies help mitigate rainfall even when substrate is saturated. That actually the delay of rainfall in terms of number of minutes from when the rainfall starts to when the water begins to leak can be significant depending on the species used. The plants with higher transpiration rate, the thirstier plants, provide better rainfall attenuation. So to finish here with just some acknowledgements to my colleagues who have in various ways helped me with the research. There are also links to the references, 2 full papers from which this presentation has been constructed, and also lastly the link to a quite sort of accessible summary on the RHS's website. When I say accessible, I mean it's not very technically written, so hopefully it would be of use to a number of practitioners in this area. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, do contact me on the email provided on the first slide.